All right. Thank you so much for your patience. Welcome, everyone, to our Critical Disability Studies Caucus-sponsored panel, Cripping the Welfare Queen, Imagining Care in the Context of Infrastructural Abandonment. I am Theodora Danny-Levitch, and I will be reading out everyone's bios right now, and then we'll sort of launch into a conversation. Jina B. Kim, over here, is Assistant Professor of English and the Study of Women and Gender at Smith College. Her research and teaching interests emerge from the intersection of critical disability studies, feminist of color and queer of color critique, and contemporary ethnic U.S. literature. Her manuscript in progress is titled Dreaming of Infrastructure, Crip of Color Writing After the U.S. Welfare State, and it examines women and queer of color writing in the afterlife of the 1996 U.S. welfare reform. Her work has appeared in Signs, Social Text, American Quarterly, Disability Studies Quarterly, the Asian American Literary Review, and Lateral, Journal of the Cultural Studies Association. Next up on the screen is Cathy Cohen, the David and Mary Winton Green Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. She formerly served in numerous administrative positions, including the chair of the Department of Political Science, director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and deputy provost for graduate education at the University of Chicago. Cohen is the author of 2 books, The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS, and the Breakdown of Black Politics, from University of Chicago Press, and Democracy Remixed, Black Youth and the Future of American Politics, from Oxford University Press. She is also co-editor of the anthology Women Transforming Politics, an Alternative Reader, from NYU Press, with Kathleen Jones and Joan Tronto. Her articles have been published in numerous journals and edited volumes, including the American Political Science Review, Nomos, GLQ, Social Text, and the Du Bois Review. Cohen created and oversees 2 major research and public-facing projects, the Gen Forward Survey and the Black Youth Project. She's the recipient of numerous awards, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and co-editor with Frederick Harris of a book series at Oxford University Press entitled Transgressing Boundaries, Studies in Black Politics and Black Communities. It is just such a joy and privilege to have you with us. All right, next is Sami Schalk, over here in the wonderful dress. An associate professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of Body Minds Reimagined, Disability, Race, and Gender, and Black Women's Speculative Fiction, out from Duke in 2018, and Black Disability Politics, just recently, out from Duke this year. Her work, yes. Her work focuses on race, disability, and gender in contemporary American literature and culture. She identifies as a fat, Black, queer, disabled femme and a pleasure activist. Also wonderful to have you with us. So Kelsey Henry, over here, is a PhD candidate in American Studies at Yale University, where she also received an MA in the history of science and medicine. Her work follows the legacies of 19th century scientific metrics of human development and racial difference, metrics forged in the crucible of racial slavery in histories of 20th century developmental science and biomedicine. She historicizes the production of developmental technologies and norms that are often perceived as race neutral, like pediatric growth charts and diagnostic criteria for developmental disabilities, interrogating the racial premises and parameters of developmental knowledge production and their material effects on Black parents and children. Kelsey's work is supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Consortium for the History of Science and Medicine, and she has previously received support from Yale's Emerging Scholars Fellowship and the Ford Foundation Predoctoral Fellowship. She organizes Yale's Disability Studies Working Group and serves as the assistant editor of Disability Studies Quarterly and is a co-host on the Disability History Association podcast. Wonderful to have you with us. Next to me on my right is Liat Ben-Moshe, who is an interdisciplinary scholar activist working at the intersection of disability slash madness, incarceration/decarceration, and abolition. She is the author of Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization and Prison Abolition, out in 2020 from University of Minnesota Press, and co-edited the Disability Incarcerated from Palgrave in 2014. Dr. Ben-Moshe is Associate Professor of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and has a lot of resources and information on her website, www.liatbenmoshe.com. Thank you for being here. All right, and my final introduction. So folks on Zoom, thank you. Just mute yourselves if you're not speaking. Thank you. So finally, Alexis Pauline Gumbs is cherished by a wide range of communities as an oracle and a vessel of love. Drawing on over 25 years of experience as a writer and facilitator, her inclusive practice finds us and brings us into the ceremonies we have always needed. Her books include Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, out from AK Press in 2020, Dub, Finding Ceremony, out from Duke University Press in 2020, M. Archive, After the End of the World, also out from Duke in 2018, Spill, Scenes of a Black Feminist Fugitivity, also out from Duke in 2016, and Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines. This one I have in my bag. I'll show it later. Love on the Front Lines, out from PM Press in 2016. Alexis was honored with a Whiting Award in nonfiction just this year, and lauded for creating modern fables that offer new methods of feeling. Alexis is also a 2022 National Endowment of the Arts Creative Writing Fellow, also wonderful. In a forthcoming biography, wait, did I skip something? In 2020 to 2021, Alexis was awarded a National Humanities Center Fellowship to work on her forthcoming biography, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. That is amazing. Alexis has taught in many settings, including as Winton Chair of the Humanities at the University of Minnesota, Evans Chair at Evergreen State University, and Distinguished Visiting Professor in Africana Studies at Barnard College. Alexis and their partner Senghor have received many honors, including an Advocate 40 Under 40 feature for their decade of work to create an intergenerational living library of Black LGBTQ brilliance called Mobile Homecoming. Alexis lives in Durham, North Carolina, where she nurtures and is nurtured by a visionary, creative community while scheming towards her dream of being your favorite cousin. So delighted to have you, Alexis. You're not showing on our screen right now. Let me do something here. Yes, here we are. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this mic over to Jina.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I have about 4 access copies for anyone who would prefer to follow along as I read. So I'm just going to offer about 8 to 10 minutes of framing comments. And I wanted to start out by saying that I am just so honored to have the opportunity to discuss my recently published article, which is titled Cripping the Welfare Queen, The Radical Potential of Disability Politics, alongside a brilliant and life-giving panel of intellectuals whose writing and imagination made it possible for this piece to exist. I also want to thank my wonderful editors, Jean Vaccaro and Joan Lubin, for shepherding this piece to completion, as well as all of Dora's amazing organizing and logistical work on getting this panel together. So this essay explicitly builds on the legacy of Cathy Cohen's groundbreaking article, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, in which Cohen famously invoked the figure of the welfare queen to intervene into then dominant understandings of queer politics. This invocation marked a departure from a single issue queer politics that, in her words, quote, rejects any recognition of the multiple and intersecting systems of power that largely dictate life chances, end quote. By broadening the category and analytic of queerness to encompass the lives of poor women on welfare, quote, non-normative and marginal subjects whose, quote, sexual choices are not perceived as normal, moral, or worthy of state support, end quote, Cohen envisioned a queer politics attuned to regulatory regimes of power, that is, to the interlocking state-sanctioned and extra-legal systems of oppression that circumscribe, exploit, and surveil Black and brown lives. I wrote this essay in hopes of performing a parallel move in disability studies, a field that has historically weathered similar accusations of centering a single-issue politic, though I think that is rapidly changing. Following Cohen, I asked, how might disability studies shift if it took up the welfare queen as a central site of inquiry? And in turn, how might a disability analysis highlight the ways that the language of inability have shaped the welfare queen and imbued her with rhetorical power? Through this line of questioning, I joined scholars such as Leslie Fry, Liat Ben-Moshe, Nirmala Aravelis, and Jasbir Puar, all of whom have explored disabilities' many entanglements with state-sanctioned violence. More specifically, I joined Leslie Fry in reading the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, alongside the passage in 1996 of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, a federal law and major welfare reform. Rather than framing the state as a haven of protection for people with disabilities, as the ADA does, we instead pay attention to how the US state itself operates as an instrument of racialized disablement through group differentiated processes of resource deprivation and ableist rhetorics of public dependency that frame racialized, low-income, and disabled populations as unrelenting parasites on the state. So shifting the frame of disability analysis to welfare reform and state-sanctioned violence, I view the welfare queen as a central figure for a form of intersectional disability analysis I term a crip of color critique. So using the framework of crip of color critique, my essay argues that the welfare queen functions as perhaps the definitive disability narrative of late capitalism, a cautionary tale of state dependency that enabled the redistribution of public resources towards elite classes. That is, the welfare queen became legible as a public figure largely through ableist language and reasoning. She's defined necessarily as a pathological mother, a social aberrancy to be rehabilitated and cured, quote unquote, through workfare programs. So in addition to analyzing the ableist reasoning and language at the heart of anti-welfare policy, a crip of color critique also considers how theories and narratives of disability might very usefully intervene into state-sanctioned myths of resource parasitism that I think are still very present and relevant and with us today. So I want to now focus on the function of refusal and rupture at the heart of this framework, which my article and the larger book project, of which it is a part, locates in the radical imagination and freedom dreaming of disabled, feminist, and/or queer of color writers. At its core, my work is about the dream work that these writers do to imagine alternate structures of support, infrastructures of survival in the face of ongoing infrastructural divestment. In my Welfare Queen article, I turned to Jesmyn Ward, and in particular, her 2011 novel, Salvage the Bones, which grapples with the deadly legacy of Hurricane Katrina through a story of Black mothering. While Salvage the Bones does not engage explicitly with a welfare mother stereotype, it nonetheless centralizes the figure of the Black teen mother through its protagonist, Esh Batiste, who grapples with the news of her pregnancy as the storm gathers momentum. This is a figure who, according to Ward herself, quote, continues to loom large in the public consciousness and provides a mythology of mothering that is still too useful to some, end quote. So by looking at this novel, I argue that Salvage the Bones offers new narratives of racialized mothering to navigate an era wrought by infrastructural erosion, in which the most basic structures for sustaining life have quite literally been washed away. Yet, rather than asking the Black mothers buried beneath these state-sanctioned myths to come clean, to borrow Hortense Spiller's formulation, Ward's novel instead counters myth with myth, redirecting myth's social and often sacred function to produce new systems of thought for a culture bent on punishing its most vulnerable members. And I actually want to say here that Alexis Pauline Gumbs's writing on revolutionary Black queer mothering in her dissertation and co-edited anthology Revolutionary Mothering absolutely gave me the framework and vocabulary to write this essay. So I argue that Salvage the Bones posits the disability justice value of interdependency as a primary means of mothering a viable world and as the ideological center of its myth-making practice. Rather than a negative property ascribed to certain segments of the population, in Ward's novel, dependency describes a life-giving relationship and social bond that is vital to survival. The novel thus foregrounds how the recuperation of dependency is not just possible, but a necessary way of contesting the punitive logics of public resource distribution. Refusing the social order reproduced by the welfare queen myth, which weaponized dependency to argue that some people deserve less than others, Salvage the Bones instead mothers a vision of survival that encompasses the nation's least supported populations. As 16-year-old Skita Batiste puts it, everything deserves to live. So now I want to actually conclude my framing remarks by discussing my continued hopes for Crip of Color critique as a potential practice of solidarity linking Black feminist, feminist of color, and radical disability politics. And towards that end, I want to offer some reflections on how my thinking has shifted even since the publication of this piece in 2021. So when I initially drafted this essay in December 2016, as well as in its final published form, I wrote that disability, quote, remains overlooked in Black feminist scholarship on welfare queen mythology. And yet, as Sami Schalk's very recent book, Black Disability Politics, taught me, disability is absolutely present in these writings, as it has long been present in Black theories and practices of political liberation. Disability is present, for instance, when Alexis Pauline Gumbs discusses the right-wing figuration of Black teenage motherhood as epidemic. It is present when Dorothy Roberts assesses the medical landscape of reproductive and childcare unfreedom. It's just not present in the ways that we have been trained to see it. And so rather than framing the scholarly encounter between Black feminist and disability thought as one of deficit, right, in which insights from one field address the perceived shortcomings of another, I want to instead think about Crip of Color critique as a method of amplification, in which we turn the volume up on what has already existed. Finally, and I definitely want to turn the mic over to my other panelists on this issue, I want to think about how Black feminist and disability theorizing are, of course, so key to conversations on the necessity of care and of forging different infrastructures of care in our current political moment. In the midst of calls for care, not cops, I think these movements are actually demanding specificity on what exactly we mean by care. So what are the forms that care can take? What does it mean to practice care? And who are the ones being called to give care, as well as the ones who are perceived as always taking? As Liat Ben-Moshe's concept of carceral ableism has taught me, the idea that disabled people need particular types of care protection has often justified their incarceration in psychiatric facilities, institutions, hospitals, prisons/jails, and beyond. Further, Black feminist and disability thinkers both have considered the many ways in which care, and the alleged care practiced in particular by state institutions, is often indistinguishable from harm and violence, and how care, in fact, or claims to care protection become the framework through which harm and violence is enacted. So in this way, state institutions are the ones who are doing the work of bad or counter-revolutionary mothering, insofar as they're reproducing a world adverse to the flourishing of racialized, low-income, and disabled lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jina. Before I pass the virtual mic to Cathy, I was realizing as I was rereading your essay, Cathy, that it's been 25 years this year since it was published, which is, what was that? Last year. Okay, I can't do math, I'm a humanities. Anyway, quarter of a century, roughly, which is really, powerful to think about. But that was just my quick comment, and I will pass the mic to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, and it has been a quarter of a century. I don't want to think about what that really means, but okay. Well, I want to start by thanking Theodora and the other organizers of this panel for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and I want to start by applauding Professor Kim for this brilliant essay, which is a brilliant essay. This work does so many things, not the least of which is it continues to remind us of how theorizing from the generative space of the margins is productive and really necessary for this current political moment. The organizers of this panel encouraged us to take our comments wherever we want it, which can be a dangerous instruction, but okay. I want to spend my time talking about how this essay is informing and really reinforcing my thinking about vulnerability, or more explicitly, the kind of radical potential of political vulnerability. I've been working on, and we would dare say struggling with, a new book on political vulnerability. It is in many ways, I think, another attempt to find broad and generative points of political solidarity, like those I tried to explore in Punk's Bulldaggers and Welfare Queens so many years ago, a quarter of a century we just heard. But let's turn to the Kim essay. Early in the essay, Kim points us to the work of the white supremacist state to create a narrative of dysfunctional dependency. Kim writes, and I quote, This narrative of dependency, anchored by ever-present mythologies of pathological Black motherhood, has virtually shaped the ongoing regime of state disinvestment. Do you need me to slow down? See, okay, all right, I'll just keep going. Kim urges, end quote. Kim urges us, however, to think of the transformative potential of interdependency and explore, quote, how dependency might function as an unexpected axis of affinity between groups framed as drains on the state, end quote. And this is really where I want to enter into conversation with Kim, because I, too, want to understand how we build broad lines of political unity centered around vulnerability. I am looking to find the resistive tissue in a society of broken people. Now, I suspect that some may object to the language of being broken, but here I'm referencing what I consider to be the theorizing of Ronaldo Hudson. Hudson, an artist, educator, and organizer, was in prison for 37 years, including 13 years on death row and 17 years of serving life without parole. In 2020, Hudson won executive clemency and came home to Chicago. In a wonderful interview with artist, activist, and educator Alice Kim in the book Carving Out Rights, Hudson details his thinking about building a society of what he calls broken people. He states, and I quote, "You may see my cracks, but they're just an indicator of my trauma, which leaves me open to change," end quote. Here, Hudson points to the trauma inflicted directly and indirectly by the state, but also offers up the possibility that trauma can also serve as a site of opportunity for transformation. Hudson would remind us of the work of the racialized state to disable large segments of Black communities through disinvestment and the ongoing project of mass incarceration. Here, I might suggest that the Black criminal, alongside the welfare queen, bolsters, as Kim writes, quote, the narrative support for an ideology and praxis of resource austerity, end quote. In fact, we might point to the medicalization of, quote unquote, Black crime and the Black criminal, especially those doing long terms, as individuals who are uncurable and thus in need of the discipline of removal from society and the denial of basic rights and opportunities. Hudson, however, recovers the language and condition of being broken when talking about what he says is his own guilt. He states, and again I quote, "You're absolutely correct that I committed a horrible crime, but I am not a monster. I'm a human being that made a really bad decision, you know. I'm looking to be part of a society of broken people." And this is the sentence, end quote. This is a sentence that is actually so impactful for me. This is where I see Hudson engaging in his own Cripping the Welfare critique, recognizing that the brokenness produced in prison is, yes, emotional and physical, but not definitive. Instead, the brokenness one experiences in and after prison is one that is only survived through interconnected support of those inside, as well as family, friends, and comrades outside. Thus, Hudson's use of broken is not a static indictment of individuals or groups, but instead provides a ruptural possibility meant to signal the chance for collective transformation. Given Hudson's insight, we might ask, how do we use a Black feminist and feminist politics and practice to build a movement of broken people? Now, let me note that for some, or maybe for many, the language of broken and vulnerable, my preferred term, not my term, but the term I prefer using, are not concepts thought to reflect, right, the ideas of resistance and struggle and liberation that often animate our freedom dreams. In conversations with younger Black activists about my own project on vulnerability, comrades have suggested that I not use, for example, the language of vulnerability to describe Black people, since they perceive it as signaling our weakness. These young colleagues have been especially concerned about my intention to use the framework of vulnerability to talk about, yes, some white people, worrying that such an approach would diminish our understanding of white supremacist power. However, in this case, I, like Hudson, want to mobilize a concept like vulnerability to highlight our collective positioning, including, yes, even some white people, as broken and vulnerable and, dare I say, queers relative to dominant state power. This kind of collective positioning is not meant to highlight our deficiencies, although it does seem that that is part of the way that we have to recognize our shared humanity. We know that Black feminist theorizing has always understood marginality and possibly brokenness as a generative space. Bell Hooks writes that, quote, marginality is much more than a site of deprivation. It is also a site of radical possibility, a space of resistance, end quote. Feminist legal scholar, we go to the other extreme, Martha Feynman writes, and I quote, the vulnerable subject must replace the autonomous and independent subject asserted in the liberal tradition. Far more representative of actual lived experience and the human condition, the vulnerable subject should be at the center of our political and theoretical endeavors. The vision of the state that would emerge in such engagement would be both more responsive to and responsible for the vulnerable subject. A reimagining that is essential, end quote. And finally, in terms of quotes, feminist political theorist Ira Zarek reminds us of the dual registers on which vulnerability exists. She writes, and I quote, in feminist and anti-racist struggles, vulnerability is intertwined, first of all, with subjection to racist and sexist violence, with bodily injury and extreme destitutions. In other words, it signifies the damaging and indeed disastrous effects of domination and power. Yet, emphasis yet, vulnerability also has a positive meaning. It can be reclaimed as a condition of intersubjective freedom, action, and political engagement, end quote. So for me, when I read Kim's excellent, I dare say brilliant, wonderful essay, it is the articulation of multiple forms of vulnerability and interdependency and the kind of political production from such a positionality that might generate all the things that we want and that draws me in. I'm committed to Kim's Cripping the Welfare critique because it demands that we disrupt the normative ideologies of independence at the individual level and insert a more radical imagining of group vulnerability, right? That ties us to others collectively, that demands a shared accountability to and for others, and under the best conditions necessitate that we imagine new ways of being and new worlds of possibility, and that we get our shit together and organize for that. Thus, I'm interested in what a group of feminists writing in a text entitled Vulnerability and Resistance suggests is a reconsideration of vulnerability in light of resistance. This will move us towards an embrace of what Kim describes as any and all movements that aim to liberate those with pathologized bodies and minds, or what Hudson might call movements of all the broken people. Now that said, I think, and I don't want to speak for you, I think both Kim and I realize that any radical potential for what I might call a politics of vulnerability will only be realized when we pair interdependency with resources, with infrastructure, and with power. I just want to say I learned so much from this piece, and it was an honor to read it and to participate. Thank you.
The mic that the Zoom people can hear is here, so I'll just switch for Jina. So next up we have Sami. They're not on. No, this is not on anymore. Oh, I turned it off. Sorry, I turned it off.
Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, hi, I'm Sami Schalk. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am extremely biased. Dr. Jina B. Kim is my longtime friend and collaborator. So my comments today are titled, Give Her Her Flowers, or Why Dr. Jina B. Kim is the Present and Future of Disability Studies. So my comments here today are a little more global and put Jina's work in some longer personal and field context. I want to give Jina her metaphoric flowers here. I did consider trying to get physical flowers, but we were trying to eat lunch, you know. For her current and future influences on the field of disability studies, because I mostly see panels like this focused on the work of very senior scholars or on books. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to love on Jina and her work in public right now. I first met Jina in 2014 at a Society for Disability Studies conference, where she was already in the midst of developing the theoretical framework of Crip-of-color critique. She presented on one of the very few race and disability panels at the conference that year. So even though it was at 8 a.m., I went and I listened and I was hooked. At that time, Jina was a graduate student and I had just finished my PhD a month before. There were so few people of color in disability studies at that time. Me, Jina, Nirmala Aravelis, Cindy Wu, Julie Avril-Minnick, who also presented on that same panel, Akimi Nishida, Juliana Nessie, Sandy Yee. And of course, there were a handful of white disability studies scholars doing critical race work in the field, well too, but it was lonely sometimes. And I was thrilled to not only find another person of color in disability studies, and a very fashionable person in disability studies, but also a person who specifically had deep intellectual roots in women of color feminism and queer of color critique, who used these perspectives to inform her theorizing in disability studies and not vice versa. It was refreshing and exciting, and it was really because of listening to Jina that I began to imagine what disability studies could look like if it was grounded in theories from feminist and queer folks of color, rather than from white disability studies scholars drawing from their traditional disciplines or from a more white mainstream feminist theory. In 2015, Jina and I, along with Julie Avril-Minnick and Jess Wagoner, were on an opening plenary panel of the Society for Disability Studies conference. And I distinctly remember afterwards saying that this kind of panel, this kind of work that we were presenting was the future of disability studies. I stand by that statement. A few years later, in 2018, Jina, Julie, and I participated in an essay series in Lateral explaining our approaches to disability studies as methodology, where, again, we emphasized the way critical race and feminist of color theory influence our understandings and approaches to disability studies. More recently, Jina and I have co-authored 2 articles, one integrating race into feminist disability studies, which makes arguments for basing our work in theories of feminists of color, and another taking a Crip of color critique approach to the concept of self-care as represented in the work of Audre Lorde, whose disability, we argue, largely influenced how she talked about self-care as an act of political warfare, long before self-care was co-opted into white lady boss capitalism, which we say much smarter in the article. All of this history leading to the publication of Jina's article that we're here to discuss today, Cripping the Welfare Queen, is just to make clear that Jina has been doing important and influential work in the field for quite some time. So, if this is the first you've heard of her or read from her, prepare yourself for so much more to come. Her book, Dreaming of Infrastructure, Crip of Color Writing After the US Welfare System, is currently under review, and we are eagerly awaiting its presence in the world. But let me at least attend somewhat to the article that brought us here today. So if there's one thing that I hope people take away from this article and from Jina's work in general, it's that discourses of disability and ableist logics work to uphold systems of oppression in ways that are easily obscured and ignored without a Crip of color critique approach. Understanding the work of ableism to shore up oppressive systems and institutions, from the US welfare state and city infrastructure to reproductive rights and the prison industrial complex, is essential not only to disability studies, but to any field that studies oppression. And this understanding, if taken up broadly, can and should form the basis of coalitional work that extends beyond the realms of academic theorizing and scholarship. This understanding that Jina offers us directly influences my own work in my book, Black Disability Politics, where I argue that there is no Black liberation without disability justice, and that Black engagement with disability politics is different because our experiences with disability are different. For me, Jina's work opens up a world where people of color can theorize disability from within our specific experiences of racial violence and state neglect to understand how disability manifests literally as well as discursively in our lives and communities. So for this and many other reasons, I am here to give Dr. Jina B. Kim her flowers and to assert that she is both the present and the future of disability studies.
Can everyone hear me? Great. So, oh.
It might be blocking the audio.
Is that better? Great. Okay. So first, I want to express so much gratitude for sharing thinking and dreaming space with this all-star lineup. Jina, Cathy, Alexis, Liat, and Sami. If I may, I've read your articles and your books and have found life sustenance and essential survival skills in each one. As you might have heard from the bios, I'm the most junior scholar here, and it's really a dream to be here with you all today. So thank you. To Jina in particular, thank you for inviting me into this conversation, and this is not the first time that Jina's invited me into disability study spaces and really shaped the trajectory of my scholarship. I met Jina at the first academic conference I ever attended. I was 19 and had just finished my first year of undergrad, and Jina was a grad student at the University of Michigan at the time. And she was giving a talk on what would eventually become a brilliant, beyond brilliant article, the one about Indra Sinha's Animal People on spatial disability and the Bhopal disaster. And this was my first exposure ever to work at the nexus of post-colonial studies and disability studies that really attended to asymmetrical processes of globalization that produce disproportionately debilitating environments in the global South. I had minimal exposure to disability studies at this point. I didn't know that that's what I would end up doing, let alone interventions that studied the entanglements between histories of colonialism, their neo-colonial aftermaths, as histories of mass disablement, which is a quick gloss of Claire Barker and Stuart Murray's work. Meeting Jina was very much a bright-eyed, I want to be like her when I grow up moment, and an introduction to Cripping the Welfare critique, perhaps before she even had the precise language for it. It's been such a gift to follow your career and to continue to learn from you now that I'm the graduate student and you're a professor, and I'm so thankful for your reciprocal support. So Jina's primary interventions in Cripping the Welfare Queen, particularly her articulation of Cripping the Welfare critique, has been an essential methodological resource in my own work. Jina describes Cripping the Welfare critique as, quote, at once a critical methodology, coalitional practice, and epistemological project, end quote, that attends to, in the words of Cathy Cohen, quote, the systematic relationship among forms of domination, end quote. Illuminating the ways that ableism and anti-Black racism, in this instance, speak for and through each other.
Like Jina, I write and think about the role that attributions of disability and disease have played in authorizing, as you've described, state-sanctioned assaults on racialized maternity. I study the racial parameters of developmental knowledge production in the 19th and 20th century, moving from the antebellum period through the war on poverty, with a focus on normative metrics, so pediatric growth charts, developmental screening tests, that have served an evaluative and classificatory function that has had an intimate effect on the lives of Black parents and children. More specifically, I follow the mobilization of developmental standards for diagnosing Black underdevelopment, for developing Black populations, and for historically entangling concepts of Blackness, development, and disability. I found a Crip of Color critique especially instructive for grasping at the relationship between the habitual severing of Black kinship ties and what Jina calls ableist ideologies around dependency, reproduction, and labor that persistently fashion the Black family, and particularly Black mothers, as an inhospitable environment for Black children to grow up in. I'm just starting to work on a chapter that focuses on the early years of Head Start, the early intervention program for low-income preschool children, inaugurated as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society campaign, colloquially associated with the War on Poverty and its related legislation. Head Start was intended to diagnose children early, many of whom were Black, with developmental delays, while also environmentally intervening in their lives to facilitate normal, healthy development. While Jina's work and the text she attends to importantly consider the circumstances of Black mothers contending with the disabling context of infrastructural abandonment, I'm really curious about how the tight conceptual coupling and material coupling of racial reproduction and disability extended into the provision of care, the extension of public resources, and wore a veneer of benevolence in early childhood education programming in the 60s and 70s. I imagine the collision point between the environmental turn among developmentalists, which was a turn away from more hereditarian theories of maturation and toward environmental dynamic models of socially mediated development, which is typically historicized as a really progressive turn from the hereditary to the environmental or the cultural, and the very complicated collision between that so-called progressive turn and the rise of sociological condemnations of Black environments, the family, the neighborhood, the culture as pathological. To the extent that psychosociological theories of Black cultural impoverishment and maternal deprivation cast Black mothers as poor conduits of normal development, diagnoses of developmental delay in Black children were coextensive with perceived pathologies of the family. Disability was an entry point for treating these domestic pathologies, supposedly intrinsic to Black family life. A Crip of Color critique is particularly well positioned for helping us understand the relationship between a shifting clinical orientation and pedagogical purview around developmental supervision in the 1960s, and desires of the state to intervene in the lives of Black families and re-territorialize a parenting role for itself in the name of developmental rehabilitation. Like most of the theoretical offerings that have become conceptual mainstays for me, Crip of Color critique serves a really therapeutic function that clarifies the overlay of Black feminist and disability politics in my personal and my professional life. So before I started grad school, I was working as a full spectrum doula in Seattle, which meant that I was doing birth work. I was working in families' homes postpartum. I also did abortion work and perinatal bereavement work. And I noticed that the fears that animated postpartum depression and anxiety in my Black clients took a completely different shape than any of my other clients. Everyone was very worried about their child's punctual arrival at every developmental milestone, regardless of race. But it was only my Black clients who feared that their children wouldn't get to be and become children or adults at all. Medical providers also could not comprehensively speak to these developmental anxieties. While they could tell a Black mother that, according to their formal diagnostic standards, their baby was perfectly normal, Many of my clients could acknowledge that chronological age is a fairly useless metric for describing the phenomenological experience of Black children, and that normative age markers evaded their children, regardless of a formal diagnosis of disability. A Cripping color critique, one that is not reliant on diagnostic categories of disability, but rather makes space for the ways that Blackness's historical alienation from human time, to use Habiba Ibrahim's language, often expresses itself and is experienced as developmental disablement. A Cripping color critique is vital for comprehending what Zakiya Iman-Jackson has described as the inequitable burden on developmental processes that are an inevitable product of Black environments. A diagnosis of postpartum depression or anxiety and the therapeutic interventions that come along with it can't actually touch the reality of anti-Blackness's torquing of developmental processes and life course events within Black families. And Cripping color critique as an analytic pulls this reality into sharp relief in extraordinarily helpful ways. I'll conclude with a couple of questions and provocations for us to consider as a group. Cripping color critique, much like the intellectual genealogies that inspired it, so feminist of color critique, queer of color critique, is animated by a coalitional impulse that constellates around shared relationships to power rather than siloed racial and ethnic identities. I'm wondering, and I'd love for us to think about this together, and I think what Jina said about Cripping color critique is a method of amplification that shouldn't be exhaustive or a substitute for other more specific frameworks. I guess my question is, when is this coalitional framework most useful, apt, descriptively accurate? When is greater specificity, naming a political, intellectual formation as distinctly about ableism and anti-Black racism, more accurate, analytically useful, ethically sound? Finally, I really appreciated Gina's point of clarification at the end of the essay. Quote, a Cripping color critique also recognizes the limitations inherent in a utopian discourse of interdependence, that in highlighting networks of informal care, potentially further erodes state accountability by suggesting that vulnerable populations can and should support themselves. I often worry about the romanticization of informal support networks, not only for their inability to address the vast expanse of state neglect and social abandonment, but for the burden this places on feminized, often low-income care workers to sustain their communities with limited emotional and material resources. I think about the high rates of burnout and professional turnover in the doula world, which is a world that I came from, particularly among doulas of color who work with clients of color and carry higher body burdens than other doulas when it comes to internalizing secondary trauma after witnessing obstetrical violence and neglect. And this is really different from medical care providers. We follow our clients home and we see the ramifications of this postpartum in a really intimate way. I'd love to open the floor to any care workers because I know that we often have dual identities and that the people in this room are academics, but there are also many other things. Anyone who might want to do some skill sharing when it comes to methods, strategies, practices of caring for the carer that they've taken part in to sustain informal care networks would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? People of the room hear me okay? People of the Zoom? Okay, cool. So I know I'm the only thing sitting between you and Alexis, so I will be short because I'm also looking forward to that. But I wanted to, thank you, Dora, for and Jina, of course, for inviting me and pulling this all together. I'm going to make 3 comments, so I'll try to be short. One is about the usefulness of Cripping of color critique. The second one is what I call cripping infrastructural divestment. And the third one is the boogeyman of reform. So the usefulness of Cripp, or what I call Cripp or /mad of color critique, I just want to I just want to start by saying that I don't know how this began, but I think I think Jina coined it first, but I think Jina thinks we coined it at the same time. I don't know. But I think we both read Rod Ferguson at the same time. And I came up with a kind of mad/disability of color critique. Jina wrote about Crip of color critique. But the point being that I think we both felt that it was a very useful framework. And one of the things that that framework does that I think is super useful, and I'm going to quote from your essay, Jina, page 82, for those of you who are following. To crip the welfare queen, then, does not necessitate labeling her as disabled. Rather, cripping underscores how ableist ideologies around dependency, reproduction, and labor give her story narrative power, which, as everybody said, of course, builds on Cathy's work, on Rod Ferguson's work, and others, and also, of course, Julie Minnick, who, in her article from 2016, speaks to the political necessity of shifting from a disability studies defined through its objects of inquiry to one determined by its method of analysis. So Cathy Cohen, Dean Spade, Rod Ferguson, and others urge us to frame issues of state violence and what Ruthie Gilmore calls organized abandonment through what Rod Ferguson described as a queer of color critique. And that this framework questions traditional white liberal approaches that call for more legislation, for example, or more legal critique, which is what Dean Spade really critiques. It questions incorporation within the status quo and within the system, what in disability studies we call inclusion. But instead, they offer an analysis through an intersectional lens that has a broader critique and analysis of what we can call freedom and what liberation might be. Yeah. It's important, so this is my little push, and push will come back in a little bit. It's important, I think, to enact a both-and approach here. A crip/med of color critique as a methodology, yes, but also as an epistemology. It's a critique of power that comes from those in proximity, in my opinion, to pathologization, of course, queering, to negative racialization, and to criminalization, at least in my work. And this is what I call the racial criminal pathologization. But I also want to say that there's also importance to ground it in a politics of depathologization. So this could come from med people, crips, disabled, people who don't identify as med or crip or disabled, people who are not politicized as med or crip or disabled. But also, and they don't identify as those things, partially, and I think it's important to recognize, because of ableist repression and because of state violence and state abandonment that Jina shows in her piece. I'm talking about things like infrastructural implosion, maiming. So these are selective and by design. The framework, again, my point here is very important, but it's important to do a both and. And in my third comment, you'll see why. So the second point is cripping infrastructural divestment. Infrastructural investment, of course, that shores up in the novels that you're analyzing, that shores up in the implosion of welfare, happened at, of course, the same time as a lot of investment went to law and order. It's important to note that this happened at the same time and by the same state, by the same government. So this is what we call the right and left hand of the state. Housing, accessible and affordable, was decimated. Healthcare was and is privatized. When budgets for corrections through incarceration, immigration capture, and so on, are skyrocketing. So in neoliberalism, and honestly in liberalism, dependency is really a proxy for expendability. It's a form of colorblind racism, as Michelle Alexander talks about it, and it's a tool for state abandonment, but it's also its justification, which is really important. As you show, Ward Ferguson, Ruthie Gilmore, and Deborah Stone also many years ago in relation to disability. The divestment of, this divestment or infrastructural collapse by design then leads to debilitation or targeted impairment on a population level, which is basically the line between biopolitics and necropolitics and what Poir calls the right to maim. The utility of a disability politic in overturning the punitive ideologies of welfare reform, Jina Kim suggests, are about reclaiming dependence and interdependence. But of course, these same punitive policies are also directed directly at disability through, when we say punitiveness, I literally mean also the way prisons and this law and order ideology literally disables people, debilitates. This is what I mean by targeting directly at disability. Or the veiled threats of what I call the institution yet to come. If you don't do this, you will end up in the institution. You will end up in the prison. And of course, the surveillance of welfare, the surveillance of disability benefits. And honestly, the medicalization of welfare, which is something I think really important to talk about. I'm no longer a sociologist, so I will not talk about that. But it did happen historically and otherwise. So state divestment is also investment at the same time. Yeah. The state and its violence remakes itself so that so-called care, as you brilliantly put it at the beginning, is now weaponized, not against carcerality, but with it. Right? And this is what you meant in terms of care not cops. We can see it in mental health courts, mental health jails, but also so-called alternatives like treatment not trauma, trying to pass that in Chicago. And this is what I called carceral ableism and saneism. I want to end this comment and then move to my last comment by just saying that things like Katrina, we're in New Orleans, well, we on the, not Zoom, we're in New Orleans, of course the book takes place in New Orleans. Things like Katrina or COVID really lifted the veil around, what Kimberly Crenshaw called the real pre-existing conditions, which are white supremacy and colonialism. And so this infrastructural abandonment that you talk about also led to divestment, not just of the state, but from the state. And we saw that with COVID in mutual aid and all of that. So, the one thing I want to say is I'm really, really would be interested in how not only Black feminist thought, but particularly Black anarchist feminist thought can connect to interdependency, to this project of mutual aid, to what many years ago me and comrades have called DIT, do it together instead of DIY, a kind of disability anarchist push. So my last point is about the boogeyman of reform. I think, and this I want to, kind of add to what Sami was saying. I really think your analysis is, shows what happens with divestment and extraction. And your analysis itself is a value addition. It's what we call disability gain, right? But the both end approach that I suggested earlier is really useful with the first part of your essay, which you talk about the novel Push. Push can be read as to be honest, that's how I read it, as an ableist spectacle coupled with racialized poverty and trauma porn. It adds to the spectacle of kind of Black suffering with no end, by really highlighting the structural harms that are facing Black women in the US during and after welfare reform, but without any of the actual consciousness and resistance to it through humor or, it has the structural analysis, but it doesn't have the kind of built-in resistance that the novels like, or memoirs like Heavy, for example, I think does. And this, Kim calls in the essay, and I'm quoting, "Minority literature and cultures are not inherently liberatory and can also operate in service of disciplinary norms," which I think is really important to think through. So what is the goal then, and this, I want to end here. What is the goal then of this disability, racial poverty porn, which is push? Perhaps it is also the boogeyman of reform, as you call the specter of the welfare queen, but a different kind of reform. So I talk in my book about exposés in relation to institutions and prisons, the kind of exposés I believe Sapphire likely saw in order to write about, and this is a quote, "the retard house where Mongo, her kid, lay on the floor in pea-clothes." This was literally the exposés of the 70s of institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. But the response to those has often been not just the boogeyman of reform, but actual reform. It led to more investment, not divestment, from state funding of institutionalization. So I'm really worried about the boogeyman of reform, but including in this novels like this. And more largely, it led to an investment in corrections at the same time as imploding the welfare state. And also people should look at Mel Chan's work around this construction of the Mongo, if people are interested. As Ruthie Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, Angela Davis, and many others note, abolition is about not just destruction, but also building. And Ruthie Gilmore always says, when life is precious, which is also really interesting in relation to precious from push, but it's also about insurrection. It's about birthing a new order. And it's about people who might not be able to resist in kind of traditional ways, but end up imploding the institution. And I'm talking about abolition, self-advocacy, anti-psychiatry. This is why I think both end is really important. These are movements embodied by disabled people. I want to end with a note about care as resistance. This is something we can see in a novel like Good Kings, Bad Kings, for example. The abandonment of the state by design and of state violence via institutionalization of young kids of color, as in the novel, can be seen on display. But also what can be seen on display is networks of kin. And Susan Birch also talks about it in relation to real-life asylums of an indigenous capture. We can see kinship. We can see feistiness. We can see humor. And yes, death and shared affinities. So the resistance to state violence, not through rights, but through defiance, through the development of a culture, of a defiant culture, and through being ungovernable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You all can hear me all right? Okay. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation, all of the forms of access that Theodora and Jina and everyone who helped organize made possible for me to be able to beam in as an independent scholar. And there's so much, there's so much gratitude for each of you. I think what I'll say is, complete agreement with the importance across time and into a deep future of this work that you have created, Jina, and the way that you've convened us. And when I say you've convened us, you've convened fields. You haven't just convened individual scholars and influences and citations, but you actually have created a gathering point that is so necessary. And I'm so grateful for you underlining everything that everyone has said before this. And I want to speak to, I really am just going to speak to where I am. And it's interesting listening to everyone. I kept changing my mind about like what I'm doing, what I'm saying. But I decided to do the most vulnerable thing in this instance, and I took Cathy's comments earlier as an oracle blessing to do that. I really am thinking about vulnerability, care, and interdependence in some deep ways. And when I think about interdependence, my thinking of interdependence is framed by Kriti Sharma's book, Interdependence, Biology and Beyond, where Kriti Sharma, who is a biologist who studies microorganisms in sediment and happens to also be a very close friend of mine and chosen family member, is thinking about interdependence not as an interaction between different beings, but as contingent existence itself. And it really challenges how I think about self-dependence, what my life depends on, and interspecies realities, all of that. And then there's also a train, but there's also such an intergenerational urge that this work brings up in me, and you could say is already there, but I think you all can still hear me even though there's a train, right? Okay. It's so important in the context of what, Jina, you name, and I love this phrasing, as the counter-revolutionary mothering of the state, and the definition of the welfare queen, not as a mother, but as a disabler of the state in a context where disabled life is defined as not life, right? That is really important as an impetus for the methodology that you're creating. And it also, because mothering is, in the way that I think about it, an intergenerational site of potential and vulnerability and care. It has me think about what this form of listening and coming together means for me as someone who is seeking to be in relationship with my ancestors, with ancestors who are who didn't have disabled identity as a politic, but who were impacted by ableism in ways that almost had me not even have access to knowing about them as ancestors. And so, as I've heard Cathy say many times, it's like we have our politics, and what is it really about? Well, it's about our brilliant ideas, and it's about our people, the people close to us. It's an intimate concern, and that means that I'm showing up as the great niece of John Gibbs Jr. John Gibbs Jr. is the son of Edith Henry, by the way. Leslie, we're cousins. But Edith Henry, my great grandmother, and John Gibbs experienced a spinal injury during birth and lived as a cognitively disabled, nonverbal person for his life. And my great-grandmother, Edith, was his primary caretaker. My grandmother and her other sisters were also caretakers. And she had this insistence that he would not be institutionalized. Like, it was very important that he would be at home and that she would be the person who was in charge of his care. And the way that patriarchy worked in my family, she actually, in an abusive situation, was forced to allow, but there's no consent and there's no real allowing my great-grandfather to send him to an institution, and he died within his first day there. And so that is tragic. But then the tragedy on top of it is that his existence was like erased from our family history. And I didn't know that he existed until I myself saw his name on the census records and started to ask people in my family, like, who is this person? And so I'm sharing that, which is hard to say, and I imagine may also really be hard to hear. I know it's triggering for me, because there is this sight of the reproduction of ableism, the reason why I fully agree that there is no racial justice without disability justice is that this separation and denial of our contingent existence is reproduced across generations in such profound ways, right? And so I'm sharing the experience of my experience of that through the institution of the patriarchal family, understanding that that's also part of how our state is organized. And I don't want to take up a huge amount of time, but I'll say that the place that I'm at with this and what I feel is so resonant about where you go with this, Jina, is that it does require dreaming. It does require dreaming forms of symbionts that are beyond what we have ever experienced, beyond what any of us living now have an embodied memory of. And I have been dreaming with this particular ancestor, John Gibbs Jr. And so I think I'll read you an excerpt of something that's coming from that very briefly, because I can't read the whole thing. And what shall I say so that it's still, so ancestral listening is a major part of my process and my practice. And I'm a hyperverbal person. And I'm listening and I'm writing and I'm writing. And what does it mean to be in relationship with an ancestor who was nonverbal and to be listening and in relationship and writing? So I think the excerpt I'm going to read is really just about my difficulty with that, but I'll let you know, sneak preview, that the dream imagines this form of symbionts, and I can't actually describe it, but the closest thing that I could actually have images for is that in this reality, there's symbionts with some beings that like are maybe kind of like what you would think of as humanoid, and some beings that are kind of like what you would think of as whales that are in complete symbiance. So it's like the humanoid inside of the whale that experiences multiple births and engagements with other beings. And each time this energy dreamt as John Gibbs Jr. comes through the baleen is another birth. So, okay, so there's this. Face of the deep. Gift to the one who wondered, too verbal to know. Gift to the one who listened, but not for her own sake. We send this transmission in honor of the forgotten one, known verbally as John Gibbs Jr. That is not his name. One of many labeled cognitively disabled, nonverbal, crippled, dumb. That is not the song we recognize. Our ancestor symbionts remembered him to us. They heard when he called. His true name, never forgotten. The sound of underneath breaking open, a wailing sound. Who is speaking? Dear listener, no one is speaking. With the weight and scatter of words, with the storm and surveillance of words, with the way words rush right up to your every experience and claim it, you are more limited than what we can show you. But the transmission comes from the singing together, the after finding, the ones you would call whales and the ones you would call disabled nonverbal futurists sing together. The ones you would call whales we know as symbiont lovers. We live inside the fleshed sound of breathing, live as one song. No one needs or wants to talk about it but you. Now listen. So I think I'll stop there and I'll just say that the sound of the train, the sound of the whales, the sound of my nonverbal kin is one sound. And I'm offering an invitation, I think, for this dreaming that we do to really be dreamy, you know, and to allow us the vulnerability of what it means to be in relationship beyond the forms that we are comfortable with. And I'm totally uncomfortable even like sharing this, even writing it, you know, as somebody who knows that I'm limited by the ignorance that ableism has given me in denial of how ableism has impacted me, within deep intergenerational denial of how ableism has impacted our family. And it's terrifying to even be on this panel, but also to be on it in this way, right? And I feel really grateful for the space that has been created for the possibility of dreaming and the richness of what you have done, Jina, in terms of really understanding that these cultural workers who are bringing these spaces for us to dream interdependence in are absolutely offering in, as you say, forms that we don't always recognize. And that unrecognizability is important. And thank you for allowing it to lead us. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this as well.